I want to welcome you to the 37th Annual CASAS Summer Institute. At this point, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about Lindsey. She's the president and principal consultant of the Woolsey Group, which is a technical assistance facilitation firm, and she works with CEOs and industry leadership to connect their needs to education, training, and economic development programs. Their mission is to ensure industries thrive and grow in their regional economies and get their people to the right education and training at the right time for the jobs that exist now in their local labor market. She engages high levels in industry engagement, understanding industry trends and opportunities, and community partnership building. So without further ado, I'd like to call up Lindsey, and she will give us a perspective from the employer side, working back to the education and training side. Please welcome Lindsey Woolsey.
So it is a true pleasure to be here. I will say over 1,000 participants. Well done. That is incredibly impressive. 37 years, I had no idea. I will say most certainly over 1,000 participants. That's my biggest audience. So this is exciting for me. It's particularly exciting because it's the right audience. And so as Pat introduced, here's what I want to talk with all of you about. And I will warn you, first of all, it's a PowerPoint. It is. That's happening. Just brace yourselves. Hopefully, I will be able to keep it engaging enough that you don't walk out or decide that you really are truly done with PowerPoints. I know PowerPoints are heavy. So a little bit more background that might tee us up here. When we talk about happy workers, happy employers, right? I think this is not new, is it? How many years have you all spent trying to figure out this equation, right? Because what you know is that if you are not actually serving the needs of your local employers, then you're doing a disservice, right, to your students and job seekers. And so the equation has been for decades, how do we make sure we, at a very nuanced and real-time level, understand what is going to make employers happy, but on behalf of the people that we serve and care about, who are job seekers and students. And so what I will introduce to you today is not new stuff, but there are some new nuances to the process of building relationships with business and industry that we have seen across the country have very powerful effects and impact on the happy worker side. And so I invite you as we go through this morning's presentation to really think through what is it that we have and what we're already doing that looks familiar to what I'm presenting, and what are those nuanced differences in process. And I will also let you know a lot of this is process, and some people don't like process. I love it. I'm just going to say, I love process because I know how important it is. Some people just want to get to the substance, right? They just want to get to the content first, and they skip over important process pieces that ultimately build the relationships and the partnerships you need to be successful with the students that you serve. And so today, and in the workshop following, process will reign. Process will be most important. So with that, let's dig in. So let's just start a little bit with the background, building certainly on Pat's comments that times are changing. Change is constant, right? We all know that verbiage. But here's what is really important, obviously, for all of our work to understand. And that is that this change comes with vastly changing skill demands in the economy. And what we're seeing is that there is an increased polarization, and you probably see this every day in your work, in the labor market. So we have talked for years, right, about the hourglass economy, the high wage, high skill, and the low wage, low skill, often the ones that are, as was mentioned, the entry-level jobs that your students and job seekers need for experience and to get a foothold in the labor market. But what we're realizing is that we, collectively, in this country, are not keeping up. This isn't politics. It isn't opinion. We are not keeping up on the basics. On the basics that allow somebody to get a fingerhold, even, in the labor market that then hopefully allows them to keep climbing. And so what we realize after many decades of trying to understand the demand side and matching up with that demand side, we realize that it's much more about, again, process, building the systems of alignment across the many, many, many different education programs, institutions, and organizations in all of our communities, as well as workforce development programming and economic development, who are getting more in the game of talent, and if they're not, they are not a modern economic development entity. And so our job now even more requires alignment and coordination. So let's just look at some numbers. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to sort of demonstrate that clearly over the years, this is what's going on. The middle class that this country takes pride in is shrinking. And what we are seeing is, again, this polarization at either end of the spectrum. Wages reflect it, the types of jobs reflect it, and the types of opportunities for advancement in jobs reflect this. The middle skill occupations that we, for the past at least a decade, have tried to focus on because they represent that opportunity for family-sustaining jobs for our individuals that we serve, is getting squeezed. And so what this means is that when we think about traditional middle skill occupations, sort of the routine tasks, certain skill levels, what we now know is that that has been replaced by new middle skill occupations that require simply a higher level of education, and probably more importantly, a higher specific type of education, right? We know, thank goodness, the dialogue now nationally is absolutely, it is not necessarily that four-year degree, but it is definitely something higher than high school. And here's the crux of it. It has got to be relevant to the labor market so that when your students and job seekers go out into the labor market, they have real currency in that labor market. And so that is requiring a set of certifications and degrees that are very precise to what industry is demanding. Have I said anything you don't know yet? Right. So here's another thing you know. Every community faces this equation. Growing good jobs plus connecting people to those good jobs, right? I'm going to try not to fall off the stage here. I'm kind of a walker, and I will get more energetic as I go. So the risk is there. Fair warning. So here's the thing. Traditionally and all over the country, these two sides of this very simple equation have been done in isolation of each other, and it still happens. No surprises. On the one side, you have a whole host of organizations, elected officials, economic development, chambers, trying to grow good jobs. And then you've got all of you and all of your education and training partners trying to make sure we're connecting people to jobs. And these things happen separately. And so the job of every community is to figure out how do we go forward making sure these are happening in coordination with each other. Because this is the typical state of play. There's a lot of you and a lot of others in every single community and regional labor market, right? There's city economic development organizations, there's county, there's regional. Economic development, you think your systems are fragmented? Economic development is very fragmented. You've got community colleges, technical colleges, universities, adult education, K through 12, career tech education, community-based organizations doing all sorts of levels and types and different trainings. You've got job centers, you've got workforce programs for vets, workforce programs for voc rehab, you've got workforce programs for TANF recipients, you've got workforce programs for older workers. I could keep going, right? That's a mess. It just is, right? I mean, you deal with it every day. It's really messy. And here's what happens. Every single one of those organizations, which is in every single community, whether you're metro, rural, or something in between, is trying with the very best intentions to reach out to their critical industries. And they're all reaching out to their critical industries. But they're doing it in isolation of each other. And so what happens is that typically the usual suspects, those manufacturers who have just always been our champions, they get hit again and again and again and again. Will you please do our job fair? Will you sign a letter of support for this new grant? Will you sit on this committee? Will you sit on this board? Will you join this effort? And then there's others that are just out there on their own and never get contacted by anyone, right? So this situation is messy because there's nobody in charge of coordinating all of us, right? There's no CEO of collaboration. Wouldn't that be great? If we just had the person who said, go here and talk to this person, but we don't. What we have is a lack of common points of accountability. And there's good reason for that. It's because we all have different missions and different funding streams. We have different performance metrics. We are different programs. Even within the same system, we are different programs, right? And sometimes, in fact, quite often, we have temporary points of accountability. This comes in the form usually of a grant, right? There's a grant that focuses on students interested in STEM. And so for a moment, we all rally around that common point of accountability, right? Or there's a grant that focuses on low income or low skilled or opportunity youth. And we all rally, and that's our temporary point of accountability, but it doesn't last, does it? Because ultimately we have to go back to our missions and our funding streams and our performance criteria. But here's the thing to note about the times are a-changing, right? It's that now we are in an era where every single program, organization, and system that I listed earlier are being called to intensify their relationships with industry. So if every one of our organizations and systems are being called on to intensify relationships with industry, just think about this. Every State of the Union address, save for the most recent one, I'll just be honest there, has mentioned the words industry-college partnership in some way, right? There has been an explicit calling out of community and technical colleges partnering better and stronger with employers. WIOA, we have legislation that explicitly calls out, 29 times, by the way, the word sector partnerships is mentioned, explicitly calling on more, better, stronger partnerships with industry. Every single program gets the concept of demand-driven. This is not new. But if you think about this intensifying of going out and building relationships with industry, the risk should be pretty clear, right? The risk is that we all go out and intensify our relationships with industry. And that mess gets messier because we're all doing it in isolation of each other. So here's some of the unintended consequences, some of them obvious, some of them less so. Employer fatigue, clearly, right? Even in our big areas where there's lots of employers or lots of manufacturers, you're still fatiguing the same ones who keep signing up for stuff. And word gets around, doesn't it? Word gets around on which companies are going to sign that letter and which companies are going to sponsor your job fair or your summer camp or whatever it might be. And then there's others that are missed altogether. But here's some of the other unintended consequences to really sink into. Not one of these programs, organizations, systems, or institutions is understanding the true demand of our critical industries that are driving our regional economies based on numbers of jobs, quality of jobs, projected growth. Not one of these organizations, no matter how good your advisory councils are, you are still getting a sliver of demand. You are getting a sliver of understanding of what advanced manufacturing in your region truly is and needs, of how healthcare organizations in your region are truly changing, and the implications on skills. And when you only understand a sliver of demand, it is incumbent on all of us to ask, do we have integrity in applying that information to our curriculum and our credentials, which is meant to be the currency for job seekers and students going into the labor market? Surveys, let's just take this as an example. A few years ago, there was a national best practice of surveying employers, and it purported that an 18% return is a best practice. You did it. You got it. You got an 18% return. Think about that. Let's just think about that. If you're already only engaging a sliver, right, of, say, let's stick with manufacturers in your regional economy or your state or whatever it might be, and then you get an 18% return on that survey, you do the math. Do we really have integrity in applying those results to our curriculum and credentials? Even if we then go back to our advisory councils and say, is this right? Again, we just keep presenting and presenting and hoping for the best when we're only engaging a sliver. So this is pretty big, right? And it's pretty big because what it does is it does not ensure that our students are getting what they need at the right time for the jobs that exist now or in the short term. None of this 10-year projection stuff, right? Now and in the short term, what are the jobs and what are they going to need? But there's a couple other unintended consequences that quite honestly are just salt in the wound, especially for organizations like yours, whose mission and true love is to serve job seekers and students successfully. And here's what it is. We know that when we don't coordinate together around responding to that demand, two things happen. We undersupply the labor market, right? We just don't get enough of whatever is demanded out there with the right skills, and companies up and leave. Even companies that have been in our communities for decades or generations will uproot if they can't get what they need. But here's the one we also don't think about, and I will hypothesize, I don't quite have the evidence for this, that it happens more often. And that is that we oversaturate. Because everybody hears that certified nursing assistants are in hot demand. And so everybody responds to that demand. Everybody hears that welders with blueprint reading skills are in hot demand, and they all respond to that. So in one region, you can have 3 community colleges and 6 different community-based organizations and 10 different workforce programs, all responding to that. And we oversaturate. And here's the thing that hurts. Probably worse than not providing somebody with access to education is giving somebody access to education, having them go through it on their own dime and time, and on the public dime and time, only for them to not be able to get a job because we've oversaturated. And why did we oversaturate? Because we didn't coordinate together around the saturation points. That's painful, isn't it? And I know that each of you can name a student that you've probably worked with who had this experience. And they don't come back, do they? They don't come back. So this is the level of consequence that we deal with because we're still not good at coordinating. We're really good at coming up with programs that respond to what we think we understand about demand. But across the country, and your community or region might be some exceptions, or it may not be, across the country, we're just not good at this. And so, that brings us, on a lighter side, to some solutions, right? Because what we're seeing around the country is that there are communities and areas that are getting better at it. And it's because they turn it on its head. So instead of engaging employers around our agenda, by the way, I'm sure you've heard this before, but I'll just throw it out there. We are the only ones who call them employers, because that's our agenda. They employ our people. So we call them that regularly, all the time, to their faces. You are nothing but an employer to me, because you employ my people, or please employ my people. Isn't that an interesting thing to even think about? Like, that's how driven by our own agenda we are. They're not employers, they are businesses with a whole bunch of stuff to tackle and figure out, including getting good employees. So our agenda, typical, right? Developing a new training program, advising on a curriculum, signing a grant, writing a letter of support, etc. But what if instead we actually could get business leaders to define and champion their own agenda and find ways for us as the many, 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 many stakeholders and public partners to plug in? And so what that would look like is literally putting them at the center. And when I say literally, I really mean literally, because these types of what have been tagged next gen industry sector partnerships, this is a tag that came about 5 years ago and has been catching on, literally puts business members at the center and facilitates that center in a way that gets them to define and name their full comprehensive growth agenda. But because around that center, education, workforce, and economic development entities are in listening and then in plug and play mode, it is a different set of outcomes that has a few important pieces to think about. One, industry is truly invested. And they're invested at a critical mass, not just the 5 usual suspects who always, bless them, sign our letters and do our job fairs. And so if we could really understand how the process of building this, we could get to impacts like really making sure we understand the skills that are needed, the precise saturation points, and have employers, have businesses really invest in their own solutions. So what I want to do, and you're going to have to bear with me while I look at my notes to do this correctly. I want to play a video. Let me try it again. Oh yeah, I have to hold it down. I was schooled on this. I want to play a video that some of you may have seen. So across the country, these next-gen sector partnerships have really caught on. They do not emerge out of a grant. They emerge because stakeholders realize this is how we need to organize. It's gained national attention from national organizations and funders. And so this is now part of, I would say, a greater movement. This is a video that is being played in lots of different rooms. I love hearing where it's being played. So some of you may have seen it, especially here in California. But I invite you to also go to nextgensectorpartnerships.com. It's where the video is, and you will find lots of tools, toolkits, testimonies, case studies of how this looks different. But without further ado, I'm actually going to play this.
Jobs. They're moving pretty fast these days. Most of us know what it's like to feel obsolete in the modern job market, or to move away from home to find a good job. At the same time, lots of local employers struggle to find the right talent to make their businesses grow and thrive. It's an unfortunate misalignment, and it's a really big deal, because if businesses aren't growing and creating quality jobs, the economy suffers. And if people can't access quality jobs, the community suffers. So what's going wrong here? What explains the disconnect between what businesses need and what schools are teaching? Aren't there a bunch of programs already working with businesses to meet their needs? Absolutely. In fact, lots of groups are trying to solve this problem, except they're doing it on their own. Education, workforce development, and economic development organizations are all talking to businesses. They're running focus groups and holding advisory meetings. What happens is that some employers are over-solicited, asked to participate in lots of different meetings and boards, while others are ignored entirely. Business leaders get burned out, industry involvement is low, and survey samples are skewed. To make matters worse, conversations with business are often organized around narrow topics like, what are your entry-level training needs? The result is that we often miss out on the bigger opportunities and needs that are shaping the industry for tomorrow, which just so happen to be the topics that business leaders are most interested in talking about. So what if we were able to flip things around a little bit? What if instead of the public sector pushing their programs and services on businesses, what if we could mobilize a whole industry to team up and engage with public partners to pull what they need from us, building the talent and skills of our local workforce while growing businesses and strengthening the sector? It's called a Next Generation Sector Partnership, and it can transform your region's economy. Next-gen sector partnerships are different than traditional sector partnerships in 3 key ways. 1, industry is at the center. Instead of organizing conversations with businesses around programs or grants, business leaders define and champion their own agenda and stay invested as a result. Industry at the center means that literally only businesses are given a seat at the center table. Public partners sit around the outside of the room in listen-only mode. Does that mean they're passive? Not at all. It means they give the floor to industry to design their own agenda, and they're poised for collective action as a result. It also means that businesses personally champion priorities. This is important. Next-gen partnerships don't advance initiatives unless there are business champions committed to them. 2, they tackle more than just workforce needs. In any growing industry, workforce is likely to be a top priority. But other things matter too, like infrastructure needs, supply chain issues, or access to capital. Next-gen sector partnerships tackle all of the above. Anything business leaders agree is important is a priority of a next-gen partnership. 3, community support. Next-gen sector partnerships are a team effort. Education, workforce, and economic development partners work together to respond to industry needs. It's not about a special initiative or a new program. It's a way of working better together. Next-gen sector partnerships work. Across the country, they're having a real impact. Metropolitan and rural areas have made timely changes to education programs at the right scale for the labor market. People are getting good jobs and keeping them. Meanwhile, businesses can hire the talent they need to grow, and they're generating new ideas, new markets, and new product lines because they're better connected with their peers. This boils down to stronger businesses and more people with better jobs. And that's what matters most in making our communities thrive. Is your region ready for something different? Visit nextgensectorpartnerships.com.